By sunrise in 1898, just outside Savannah, Georgia, the sisters found the chapel door standing open to the frost. Sister Catherine Voss had walked that corridor 10,000 mornings. Never once in 32 years had she failed to return from the pre-dawn office. The other women knew her footstep on the flagstone. A light, quick step, never hurried. She was a woman of mathematics and discipline. She kept the convent ledger. She knew the count of every candle, every grain of incense, every nail in the chapel beams. People trusted her because she did not ask to be trusted. She simply showed up. At 4:30 that morning, she had genuflected before the altar. 3 other sisters were there. They heard her say the final words of lauds. They watched her rise, gather her beads into her hand, a rosary of dark wood and worn silver, and bow her head to the crucifix one last time. Then she had turned toward the side corridor. The corridor that led to the dormitory stairs. 20 paces. She had walked it in darkness and light for more than 3 decades. No stairs, no turns, just flagstone, stone walls, and a lantern on a hook that hung halfway down. When she did not appear for prime, Sister Margaret went to find her. The corridor lantern was still smoking. Its flame had burned down to a thin blue line, but it was still alight. The wick had not been trimmed that morning. The glass held heat. No one had trimmed it in hours. On the pew nearest the side chapel door, a door that opened onto the convent grounds, lay Sister Catherine's rosary. The beads were coiled neat and precise, as if she had just set them down. And when Sister Margaret picked them up, she felt the warmth still in the wood. Not body warmth. Something else. A deep, slow heat, like something that had been lying in sun that hadn't risen yet. Sister Margaret's hand shook. She dropped the beads back onto the pew. They clattered once and settled back into their coil. The search began before the women had even called for Father Brennan to come from the rectory. They opened every door of the convent. They checked the kitchens, the washhouse, the root cellar. They went into the gardens where frost still held the ground hard. Sister Catherine was not in any of them. Father Brennan arrived within the hour, his breath visible in the cold, his collar crooked from dressing too fast. He stood in the side corridor and looked at the lantern, at the open door, at the pew where the rosary still lay coiled. "Has anyone looked outside?" he said. They had. 4 of the sisters had already crossed the convent yard, calling her name into the half-dark. The frost on the parish steps was unbroken. Not a single footprint marked the stone. The ground beyond the steps, the bare earth where the grass never grew, packed hard from 60 years of foot traffic, showed nothing. No mark of a shoe, no scuff, no indication that anyone had stepped there at all that morning or the night before, or perhaps for weeks. But the rosary was warm. By 8 o'clock, men from the parish had gathered at the iron gates. By noon, a dozen more. They organized themselves without being asked. They brought lanterns even though it was full daylight. They brought ropes. They brought dogs from 2 houses nearby. The dogs were kept on short leads, nervous and unwilling to move far from the men who held them. What began to spread through Savannah that day was not yet fear exactly. It was a kind of knowledge, the kind that moves through a small city without need of newspapers or official word. Something was wrong in a way that the city's ordinary explanations could not accommodate, and by that evening, people had begun to change their habits in ways they could not fully articulate. Men in Savannah, Georgia, started to avoid walking past the convent after dark, not because they believed anything specific, but because something in the city's bone had registered a break in the ordinary pattern. And in a place that size in that year, in that fog-ridden coastal town, such a break never healed quite the same way. The question that moved through the city, unspoken in drawing rooms and whispered in kitchens, was simple and impossible. Where did a woman in a white habit go when the ground showed no footprints and her beads still held the warmth of hands that were no longer there to explain it? By evening, the first rag strips had been tied to the fence posts that marked the convent property line. The search would begin in earnest the next morning. But already, in the growing dark, people were beginning to understand that some questions asked in 1898, in a port city built on tidal mist and old stone, did not answer themselves. Some questions, once asked, became part of the city's permanent weight. The Rosary lay on the pew all that night, no one willing to touch it again. On Thursday evening at 5:15, Sister Catherine had been seen in the scriptorium on the east side of the convent. She was copying the Psalms in a ledger, a task she did every third day. Sister Margaret had brought her tea. Sister Catherine had not looked up. Her hand moved across the page without hesitation, the pen scratching in a steady rhythm. The light was already failing. The room was cold. "I'll need a candle soon," Sister Catherine had said. Not a request. A statement. She was a woman who worked past dark because the work had to be finished, and stopping before the work was finished was not something she considered. No one had seen her after that. At 3:30 the next morning, Friday, the morning she disappeared, Father Brennan had heard the bell in the tower ring once, just one strike. Not the bell pull that hung in the bell tower, which would have produced a full, resonant tone. This was different. This was the sound of something striking the bell from the inside, something small and solid like a piece of stone or a key. He had been half asleep in his room. He remembered lying in the dark, listening, waiting for the bell to ring again. It never did. At 4:10, one of the parish workers, a man named Caleb who came early to lay the fires, had been walking down the path from the rectory to the convent kitchen. He had heard something that made him stop, a sound like someone humming but not quite, a low, sustained note almost like wind through a narrow gap. Coming from the direction of the side gate, he had called out, "Hello?" No one had answered. He had thought perhaps it was a cat or an animal caught in the fence. He had gone to the kitchen and lit the fire anyway. At 4:00 the office bell had rung normally. The sisters had gone to chapel, Sister Catherine among them. By 4:15, she was gone. When Father Brennan had assembled the search party the next morning, he sent men in pairs to walk the convent grounds, then outward in an expanding grid. They tied lengths of white cloth to the fence posts, rag strips that could be seen even in poor light, to mark which areas they had already covered. They wanted no wasted steps. They wanted no searching done twice. The dogs refused almost immediately. The 4 dogs that the men had brought were trained and steady. They worked cattle. They knew how to cast and to search. But when they reached the eastern boundary of the convent property, beyond the garden wall, they stopped. All 4 of them. They lay down on the cold grass and would not move. Not pull, not urging, not even hunger could make them rise. They lay with their noses to the earth, and from deep in their chests came a sound like crying. "Never seen them do that," one of the men said. His name was Thomas. He worked at the harbor, moving cargo. He was not a superstitious man, but something in the dog's refusal had registered in his bones. The men looked at one another. They were not sure what they were supposed to do with a dog that would not move. They continued on foot. By midday, they had covered 2 acres without finding anything. No cloth from a habit, no sign of disturbance, no indication that anyone had moved through the scrub past the fence line. But as they walked, strange small things began to happen. One man, a carpenter named Garrett, swore he heard a 2-note whistle coming from behind them, even though they were walking in a line, and there was no one behind them. The whistle had a particular sound. A cattle whistle. The kind a drover used to move stock. But there was no drover in Savannah, Georgia that morning. There was no one but these men in the city and the cold ground. A second rag strip tied to a fence post in the early morning had disappeared by afternoon. Not blown away, gone completely, no sign of it. But 3 posts further down a rag strip had appeared that none of them remembered tying. It was freshly knotted. The knot was tight. By 2:00 the men had begun to move differently. They walked closer to one another. They stopped calling Sister Catherine's name. Some of them had started to feel watched, though when they looked behind them or to the sides there was nothing visible except the city in the distance and the scrubland stretching flat and empty under the February cold. At 2:30, Father Brennan called them back to the convent yard. It was not yet dark, but the light was beginning to fail. The men gathered in the flagstone square. Their breath came in clouds. Nobody spoke much. They had covered a large area and found nothing, and each of them had begun to understand in a way they could not fully articulate that something was wrong with the search itself, not just with what they were searching for, but with the act of searching. It was as if the ground they were walking on was not answering their questions. It was keeping its own counsel. As they stood there, Father Brennan noticed something on the chapel steps. A single rosary bead. Just one, a wooden bead the color of dark mahogany, with a thin silver wire threaded through it. It lay on the lowest step, resting on the frost. "Did anyone walk on those steps today?" he asked. No one had. All day they had kept the steps clear out of habit, out of something that felt like respect, even though they did not know for what. The bead was not warm, but it was precisely positioned. It looked as if it had been placed there carefully recently, by someone who knew exactly where it should rest. It was a single bead from Sister Catherine's rosary. The same rosary that still lay coiled on the pew inside the chapel, completely intact. That was when one of the older men, a fellow named William who had worked the harbor in Savannah, Georgia, for 40 years and had seen ships come and go and seen men die in the water, and had always known the difference between what was possible and what was not. He had stepped back from the group and made a sound like air moving through a throat that no longer needed it. "We're not looking for her," he said. "We're looking for the evidence that she was ever here to begin with." That night, no one walked past the convent alone. By the next morning, rag strips began to appear on the fence posts in patterns that no one remembered creating, and the search, which had begun with discipline and purpose, had begun to feel like something else, like a ritual performed by people who were not sure what they were asking of the ground, or what the ground might already have decided to give them. By the third day, the search had transformed into something that resembled a ritual more than an investigation. Men came to the convent at dawn and left at dusk. They brought hooks and ropes. They dragged the hook through the shallow water that collected behind the convent garden after winter rains, listening for the sound of metal catching on something solid. Nothing. They marked the areas they had already searched with more rag strips. The fence posts now held dozens of them, a terrible record of ground that had given nothing up. Women brought food. They arrived in the late morning with baskets containing bread and cheese and cold meat. They set the food on tables in the convent yard, and then stood at the edges of things watching. Not speaking much, just watching, as if by watching they could ensure that the ground remained solid, that women did not simply cease to exist between one moment and another. Father Brennan tried to maintain order. He had established a logbook. Every day he wrote the date and the time and the names of the men who had come to search. He wrote the areas they had covered. He wrote what they had found, which was always nothing. But he wrote it down anyway, creating a record, creating the evidence that they were doing something, that the city was not simply failing in the face of an impossible erasure. By Friday, 5 days after Sister Catherine had walked into the side corridor, a kind of despair had settled over the search. Not the despair of failure exactly, but the despair of understanding that they were performing an action whose meaning had already been decided by forces they could not name or touch. The men still came, but they moved more slowly. They spoke less. They did not whistle or call to one another the way workers usually do. The dogs still would not venture past the eastern boundary of the property, and no one tried to force them anymore. It was on the morning of the 6th day, Saturday, that someone found the entry in the convent ledger. Sister Margaret had been keeping the record since Sister Catherine's disappearance. It was work that had to continue. The ledger sat in the scriptorium, and the pages had to be turned and observations recorded. The sisters had to account for supplies, for the movements of the community, for the ordinariness of their days even in the face of the impossible. Sister Margaret was entering the morning count of candles remaining in the storage room when she turned the page and saw something that was not hers. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, precise, mathematical. Sister Catherine's handwriting. The entry was dated Saturday, February 19, 1898, the same Saturday morning that Sister Margaret was standing in the scriptorium looking at the words. The entry said, "The gate will open. Tell them not to fear the light at the far edge." Nothing else. Just those words, written in Sister Catherine's steady hand, dated for a day that had not yet finished. Sister Margaret stood with the ledger open in her hands. She did not move. She did not call anyone. She stood and looked at the words until they began to blur, and then she closed the book very carefully, as if closing it too quickly might make the writing disappear entirely. When she did tell Father Brennan, he came to the scriptorium. He looked at the entry. He looked at the date. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Show no one else this page." "Not yet." "What does it mean?" Sister Margaret asked. "I don't know," Father Brennan said, and then, after another long moment, "I don't think we're meant to know." That afternoon he stopped adding entries to the search logbook. The pages after Friday remained blank, as if he was unwilling to write the story forward into a place where the dates and times no longer corresponded to any world that he recognized as comprehensible. By the evening of that 6th day, theories had begun to move through Savannah, Georgia, not spoken in any formal way, but whispered in drawing rooms, passed between neighbors, the kind of talk that people engaged in because talking about impossible things was better than simply sitting with the silence of them. Some said she had enemies. There had been a man, a merchant's son, who had pursued her before she took her vows. Perhaps he had never stopped. Perhaps he had found a way into the convent grounds that no one understood. Perhaps he had taken her. But this theory broke apart when men asked themselves, taken her where? Carried her through the city? No one saw him. No one saw anything at all. Others said the land itself was the culprit, that there were places, even in cities, where the earth did not obey the ordinary laws. That past the eastern boundary of the convent property, the ground was different. The ground did not hold footprints. The ground did not give back what was placed into it. That she had walked into a place and the place had closed behind her the way water closes over something that sinks. But a few, the old men who had already lived past 60, who had seen the harbor in Savannah, Georgia for decades, and had learned to read the signs of things that did not make sense. A few of them said something that made other people turn away from them, that made them seem suddenly unreliable or touched by something they could not describe. They said it was not a man who had taken her. They said it was not the land that had closed. They said that on the night before she disappeared, something had come for her. Not a person, not a force, but something that had been waiting. Something that she had answered to when she turned toward that side corridor at 4:30 in the morning. Something that had been calling to her in a voice that only she could hear, in a language that the rosary beads understood, but that no one else in the city had yet learned to speak. "That's foolishness," Father Brennan had said when these words came to him. But he had said it quietly, and he had not tried to suppress them. After that day, something in Savannah changed. Parents began to tell their children, "You do not walk past the convent after dark," not because it was dangerous in the ordinary sense, but because the air there was different. The light there was wrong. Something about the stones themselves had shifted into a configuration that made it unsafe to move through too carelessly. The sisters themselves, the ones who remained, began to change their habits. No one walked the side corridor alone anymore. Someone always accompanied someone else. They moved in pairs or groups. The side corridor, which had been an ordinary space that any religious woman might traverse 100 times without thinking, had transformed into something that required courage and companionship to cross. The men in Savannah, Georgia, who worked the harbor or the warehouses or the shipyards, they began to tell the younger men something that the older ones knew. You do not come to the convent alone. Not in the early morning when the light is still incomplete. Not when you can hear the harbor fog moving between the buildings like something breathing. You come with others. You keep your eyes forward. You do not answer if you hear a sound that seems to come from behind you or from places where nothing should exist. And the search, the careful, organized search that had been conducted with rag strips and hooks and dogs and logbooks, it slowly stopped. By the second week, there were no more men arriving at dawn. By the third week, the rag strips had weathered and faded, and some had blown away entirely. The ones that remained hung on the fence posts like mourning ribbons, like evidence of a ritual that had concluded not because it had succeeded, but because it had been overtaken by something larger than itself. The convent ledger remained in the scriptorium with its impossible entry, dated Saturday, February 19, 1898. Father Brennan had placed it on a high shelf, not hidden exactly, but removed, not kept where it could easily be found. When Sister Margaret asked if it should be destroyed, he had said, "It is a record. It belongs to history, even if history no longer recognizes it as part of the ordinary order of time." In the chapel, on the pew where it had been found, the rosary remained, coiled and neat. It was never warm again, but no one touched it, and no one could quite explain, years later, why it had never been moved or placed somewhere else. It simply stayed on that pew, in that chapel, in that convent in Savannah, Georgia, where a woman had walked into the pre-dawn dark and returned only as entry in a ledger dated after her disappearance. A message from a moment that should not have existed, from a hand that could no longer hold anything at all. By that winter of 1898, after the search had ended and the rag strips had faded, something had taken root in the city's bone. A knowledge, a kind of scar tissue that would never quite heal. People there, the old hands, the ones who remembered that February, they began to tell new workers, new arrivals, new residents. There are places in this city where the ordinary rules do not apply. There are corridors you do not walk through alone. There are gates you do not approach in the pre-dawn dark. There are sounds you do not answer to, and there are records, the things written down in ledgers, the evidence of words spoken from beyond the moment they should have been spoken, that tell you nothing and everything all at once. And in the chapel, the rosary remained on the pew, still and quiet, waiting perhaps for someone to ask the right question, or perhaps for no one ever to ask anything at all. 27 years passed. Sister Catherine's disappearance became the kind of story that a city carried in its bones without quite acknowledging it. The people who had lived through it, who had tied the rag strips to the fence posts, who had heard the two-note whistle, who had watched the dogs refuse to move, they grew old. Some of them left Savannah, Georgia. They went to other cities, other ports, other lives. But they carried it with them. The story, the weight of it, the knowledge that somewhere between one moment and another, a woman could simply cease to exist, leaving nothing but warm beads and impossible words in a ledger. The ones who remained in the city changed how they lived. No parent in Savannah allowed their children to walk past the convent after dark, not as a rule written down anywhere, but as a fact understood the way children understand danger before anyone has to explain it. The convent stood on its corner of the city, and everyone knew not to go there. The knowledge had become part of the air, part of the understanding of how the world worked in that place. By 1905, children who were born after Sister Catherine disappeared had never seen the convent after sunset. By 1910, it was simply accepted that the building existed in daylight only. After dark, it belonged to something else. The sisters who worked there, the community that had been fractured by the loss, they established new rules that never appeared in any formal document. The side corridor was never walked alone. Morning offices were conducted with doubled presence. At night, every door was locked. The gate was secured not once but twice. It was as if the building itself had learned to hold its breath, to keep watch, to refuse to become a place where things simply disappeared. Men who worked at the harbor, and by 1920 there were new men, younger men who had not been there in 1898. They would be told by the older hands during their first week of work, "You do not approach the convent property alone. Not in the early morning when the fog is still thick off the water, not when you cannot see more than a few paces ahead. And most importantly, you do not answer if you hear something calling from that direction. You do not respond to a sound that seems familiar but is not quite right. You keep walking. You keep your eyes forward. You move toward light and other people." These instructions were given as simply as any other work advice, but underneath them was something deeper, a kind of collective knowledge, a shared understanding that Savannah, Georgia, held a place within it where the ordinary rules had broken down, and they had not been rebuilt. By 1925, the convent had become a kind of monument to silence. Tourists sometimes asked about it. People from other cities, passing through the port, would inquire about the old religious building with its particular architecture, its enclosed garden, its air of deliberate isolation. The people of Savannah would deflect these questions. They would say it was old. They would say it was a working convent still. They would say nothing more, because the story had become something that could not be explained to someone who had not grown up in its shadow. The Rosary remained in the chapel. No one had moved it. By 1925, it had been there for 27 years. Dust had settled on the beads. The wooden surface had darkened with age and light, but it remained coiled on the pew, and no one would have dreamed of removing it. It had become part of the building itself, part of the structure, part of the evidence. In 1930, a new priest arrived at the rectory. Father Brennan had died in 1912. The new priest, Father Sullivan, was young and from outside the city. He did not know the story the way the older people knew it. On his third day at the parish, he asked Sister Margaret, now an old woman, her hands thin and spotted. He asked her why the chapel had an empty pew with beads on it. Sister Margaret had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had said, "Those are not beads that should be touched. That is all you need to know." He had tried again several times. Each time she had refused to tell him. By his 5th year at the parish, Father Sullivan had stopped asking. The knowledge of Savannah, Georgia, had begun to settle over him the way it settled over everyone who lived there long enough. There were things that the city understood without explanation. The Rosary was one of them. By 1950, Sister Catherine's disappearance had become legend in a way that made it difficult to separate what was fact from what had been transformed by 52 years of telling and retelling. But certain elements remained fixed. The fact that she had vanished without trace remained fixed. The fact that the ground showed no footprints remained fixed. The fact that her rosary had been warm remained fixed. The fact that an entry had appeared in the ledger dated after her disappearance. This remained fixed, though fewer people had actually seen it and could verify it. The newer generations knew it more as story than as documented fact. But theories had evolved and multiplied over the decades. Some people in Savannah, Georgia, the rational ones, the ones who worked in trade and commerce and preferred explanations that did not disturb the ordinary order of things, they said she had been taken by a man, a suitor who had refused her rejection. Perhaps he had hidden her somewhere in the city. Perhaps she had been spirited away by ship to another port. These people did not like to dwell on the questions that undermined this theory. Where were the witnesses? How had no one seen anything? How had the gate remained locked? How had the ground stayed unmarked? Others said it was an accident of geography. The ground past the eastern boundary was unstable. She had fallen into a hidden fissure. The fissure had opened and closed. This explained the lack of footprints. Perhaps the ground had been soft and her footsteps had been erased by settling earth. This explained her absence. But it did not explain the warm rosary, or the entry in the ledger, or why dogs refused to venture into that area even decades later. And when asked about these things, people who held this theory would grow quiet. They would say that some explanations left gaps. They would say, that was life. They would say it was better not to ask too many questions about things that had already been decided by time. But there were others, old men now, grandfathers, people who had been there in 1898 and could not forget. There were a few of them, sitting on porches in the evening light, who would say something that made even their grandchildren lean away. She was not taken by a man. The ground did not claim her. Something called to her, something that had always wanted her. And she answered, not because she wanted to, but because the answer was already written in a place beyond the moment she was asked. That entry in the ledger, that was not prediction. That was not a note she left before she vanished. That was a message from after. From a time and place where she had already ceased to be in the way we understand being. That was evidence of a voice speaking backward through time, and it was evidence that terrified anyone who thought about it too closely. These people would say the land out past the fence does not kill, it does not steal, it chooses. And it chose her. But very few people said this out loud, and fewer still believed it, or admitted they believed it. Because belief in such things required accepting that the world worked in ways that the modern age, even by 1950, was not supposed to acknowledge. What remained certain was this. People in Savannah, Georgia, had changed how they lived. No one walked the convent grounds alone after dark. Children were forbidden from playing near the fence posts. The street that ran nearest the property was avoided during certain hours. Fishermen from the harbor did not anchor their boats in the small inlet that ran past the convent land. Deliverymen who came to the property during daylight hours reported that the sisters always met them at the gate. No one was allowed to walk the convent grounds unaccompanied, and every person who had lived in Savannah long enough to understand, every person who had grown up hearing the quiet warnings, the small interdictions, the careful instructions about where not to go and what not to do, they carried a scar, not visible, but there, a kind of social wound that had never quite healed, a place in the city's understanding where the ordinary rules had broken down and had never been fully restored. New workers arriving at the harbor would be told. New families moving into neighborhoods near the convent would be warned in vague terms about the peculiarities of that building. Mothers would tell their daughters, "There is a place in this city that is not safe the way other places are safe." Fathers would tell their sons, "You do not go past the convent alone," and nobody ever quite explained why, because the explanation had become too large to articulate. It had become simply a fact. The way the harbor was there, the way the city was built, the way some things were understood without needing to be explained. By 1950, 52 years after Sister Catherine had walked into the side corridor before dawn and never emerged, the story had transformed into something that belonged to the city itself. It had stopped being a mystery that might be solved and had become instead a permanent feature of how Savannah, Georgia, understood itself. The place where a woman disappeared and changed the entire architecture of how people lived and moved through space. The Rosary remained in the chapel, dust-covered, untouched, a monument to a moment that should not have been possible but that had nonetheless occurred, leaving only beads and impossible words and the collective understanding of an entire city, that some things, once they happen, change the world in ways that never quite heal. And so the question remains even now, moving through the decades and into the present, passed between old hands and younger ones, whispered in the dark or spoken in the late afternoon, when the light is failing and people have time to think about such things. What detail in this story should not exist in a normal world, and why do people in Savannah, Georgia pretend they never saw it? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.